I've just come back from a 3-week trip across the United States of America, and honestly, it's completely changed how I think about investing. I traveled to 9 different cities, met dozens of Muslim entrepreneurs, investors, and community leaders. And as a Muslim investor, I came away both inspired and a little bit shocked. So in this video, I want to share with you what's actually out there for Muslim investors in the USA, both for Americans and for those investing into the US from abroad as well. And to be perfectly honest, the trip had such a profound impact on me and what I learned that I'm now seriously considering moving to the USA myself, but more on that bombshell a little bit later. If you're new to this channel, I'm Ibrahim, and since 2016, I've helped thousands of Muslims sort out their personal finances and investing. I run an investment firm called Curate Capital, and I've written a best-selling book and hold qualifications in Islamic law, investment management, and corporate law. The first thing I learned is that when it comes to halal investing in public equities, the US is actually pretty well catered for. You've got mutual funds like Amana, which is the big daddy, and you've got Azad. And then on the ETF side, you've got SPUS, and then you've got Halal, which is the Wahid ETF as well. And then on top of that, there are a number of sharia-compliant registered investment advisors, or RIAs, on hand to help Muslims that need that one-on-one help. And these guys will actually sometimes maintain their own actively managed portfolios as well. And they include people like Azad, Saturna, Crescent, Nama, Sharia Portfolio, and others as well, to name a few. Together, these options give Muslims in America a decent coverage of the US stock market and somewhere where they can manage the pension pots, in particular the IRAs. There's a number of products, the returns are competitive, and the regulatory environment is pretty robust. And I know some people have issues about the level of fees, but I feel like they're being a bit picky and they're comparing apples and oranges. Of course, if you compare a Vanguard fund with trillions in it versus an Islamic fund that has, maybe hundreds of millions, then of course you're going to see some fee difference. And the level of competition does mean, I think, that fees are going to come down even further over time. So I don't think that is really the beef. I think there's a lot of potential to create more ETFs, and I hear that folks are looking at doing that. Particularly Munzil is keen to do something like that in the US market, and I know others are looking to do ETFs as well. So I suspect the flavors are actually going to increase over time, and then I suspect fees will continue being eroded away as well. And the growth in this ecosystem is good news for Muslims everywhere, because the development in the US often sets the pace globally. Funds like SPUS and companies like Saturna and Zoya and Wahid all started there before expanding worldwide, making halal investing more accessible for everyone. So overall, yes, new products are important and they're coming, but it's more now about helping Muslims actually use what's already available, but more on that later. Okay, number 2, the thing with private markets is that they're still very early, but they're full of potential. While public equities are fairly well catered for, the picture is pretty different when it comes to private markets. Now, when I say private markets, I'm talking about investments that aren't listed on the stock exchange. Things like venture capital, private equity, startups, private credit, real estate funds. These are the kind of investments where you're buying into companies directly and not through shares that are traded on the open market. And this is where I think things get very interesting, because for Muslim investors, this space is still very early, and there are now regulatory changes that are being pushed by people like Donald Trump that mean that more and more, particularly US investors, are going to be able to take their pension pots, which is the largest pot of money out there, and start to hold private investments in a way that they hadn't historically been able to do. So rather than just owning mutual funds, they can now own real estate, they can now own private credit funds, they can now even own private companies in the private equity space. And that is going to be a very seismic change. But to do that, you need to have the investment world actually catch up with that. And that isn't quite there yet. There are a handful of promising players, a few smaller venture funds like Friday Ventures, Alif I came across as well, some very small private equity efforts and some small private credit offerings as well. That's where I think there's the biggest gap, by the way, private equity and private credit. Some emerging venture syndicates doing some deals as well. Munch VC is one, but nothing yet at real scale. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. In many ways, it's a reflection of where the ecosystem is at. The ambition is there, the capital is there as well, but the coordination and institutional structure are still developing, because I guess previously the institutions built for what the regulatory landscape and what the investment landscape was at the time. But now, as that changes and the lines between public and private blur and there's this shift towards private, I think you're going to see all of that infrastructure start to catch up. It's quite different to what we're seeing in the UK, where the Muslim investor base tends to be smaller but more cautious, and people prefer steady returns over taking big swings. In the USA, really, the mindset is let's back 10 ideas, 8 might completely fail, 2 might go big, and that's perfectly fine. So they take this almost like venture style attitude to life in general. And that attitude is actually a bit of a strength. It's what fuels innovation and gives rise to unicorns. So for Muslim investors outside the US, this is an exciting space to watch. Once American Muslim venture capital and private equity funds start operating at scale, they will unlock entirely new pathways for sharia-compliant capital to flow into the real economy, not just stocks and property, but real businesses solving real problems, not just for Americans, but actually for Muslims across the world. And a really important addendum to this, by the way, that there's a dynamic that I think is important to talk about, is there's a lot of very senior Muslims in very senior positions at founder or partner level, even at mainstream firms in the USA. And this is very impressive and very useful for us as a community. But as an investor who really cares about Sharia compliance, there's nothing out there for them, just completely out of the tin, ready to go, certified Sharia compliant. But if you've got a larger checkbook, let's say 5 to 10 million, and you're willing to write that into funds, then there are actually growth funds in particular and venture funds, which is the area of private markets that requires the least bit of restructuring to make it Sharia compliant, because the underlying investments are basically perfectly fine because they're just tech companies often, right? So you can actually structure stuff in a Sharia compliant way pretty quickly. So if you've got a decent sized checkbook, then there are firms like Aldrich Capital, Red Glass Ventures, even more mainstream firms like Prism Capital, and then there's Grey Matter Capital, Ascension Ventures, Watershed, and there's so many others actually out there that you could have a chat with, and the founding partners and the founders are very values aligned, shall we say, and something can be done there in my view. But as I said, for the average American and for the average investor globally, there still needs a lot of work to do even to give them access to growth and venture, let alone private equity and private credit and real estate. All of those things are not as well catered for. And talking of real estate, Americans are in love with real estate, just like all of the other Muslims I've ever met globally. From New Jersey to Dallas, everyone had a property story. There's always some guy who's flipping houses, someone who's managing short-term rental, someone who's pooling money into a multi-unit deal. And we're not talking 200K, 500K. We can actually be talking sometimes up to 10 million, 20, 30 million. So even smaller deals and even mom and pop operations actually end up scaling to a decent size in America just because of the scale of the market. But what really stood out to me were the tax advantages. In the UK, property investing comes with headache, right? You've got stamp duty, you've got Section 24, you've got capital gains, the list goes on and on. In the USA, you've got things like cost segregation and bonus depreciation, which basically allow you to write off portions of the property's value against your taxable income. So you can literally depreciate the value of your real estate over a period of a couple of decades, and you can then potentially accelerate that depreciation as well, which means that for clever people, you end up paying little to no tax on your real estate investing portfolio, which is a complete game changer. Combine that with the sheer scale of the American housing market, and it's easy to see why so many American Muslims are deeply into property. So real estate in the US is thriving, just mostly at that kind of micro level, that kind of 500K up to 10 million level. There's lots of smaller operators, community-led deals, and family partnerships. So the potential is massive. And if that energy can be channeled into a larger, professionally managed, Sharia-compliant real estate fund or funds, then I think there's going to be a lot of uptake for that by US investors and also overseas investors. One of the areas that really caught my attention on this trip was Islamic home financing. In the UK, the halal mortgage space is still developing. There are a few solid options out there like Gatehouse and StrideUp, but the availability and pricing can be challenging at times. In the US though, the picture is very different. and it's much more established. There are several dedicated providers operating at national level. Names like Guidance Residential, UIF, which is University Islamic Financial, Devon Bank, or Devon Bank as the Americans like to call it. And then you've got the likes of Amin Housing and Nia in the shared ownership space. And then you've got new entrants like Stearns Bank, which is coming in particularly focused on endowments and masajid and also commercial developments. Between them, they've written over 10 billion in Islamic home financing, which is about 4 to 5 times what the UK has done. And now I still want to dig deeper into the finer points of how each of these different products have been structured in the US. So stay tuned for a separate video on that. And I know in the US, the levels of skepticism about the structures is a little bit higher, actually, frankly, than the skepticism that we see in the UK. And that might be partly because they're beholden to the rules that are set by Freddie and Fannie, which are the two massive government-backed entities that buy up basically all these mortgages. But we'll get into that in further detail in another video. But overall, first impressions look very promising, and it's really interesting to see basically smaller but mainstream banks like Stearns Bank coming into the market as well, because that's only going to deepen the liquidity that is available for Muslims to do real estate in America. The American Muslim mindset is totally different, and we can learn from it. One of the biggest things that stood out to me on this trip was just how different the American attitude is. Americans talk big, they sound confident, and sometimes a little bit too confident. If you let them talk, Americans will literally talk at you for an hour. You can just sit there quietly, and they will often say very little in that period of time as well. It's an amazing kind of ability they have. No wonder they ended up with Donald Trump as their president. Anyway, statistically, they're much more likely to be blagging and overreaching when they're speaking. That's honestly my assessment as a Brit coming in. But here's the thing. They're also much more likely to take action as a result of that. They'll try, they'll fail, they'll pivot, they'll try again, and they'll back other people who are doing the same thing, because they know that everyone, the level of blagging, the percentage of blag in a statement is just that much higher, right? And so they've just adjusted for that, factored that in, and said, look, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to do more action, and I'm going to accept the risk. And then accepting that, they end up doing more, and they end up taking slightly higher risks, but then they end up getting much more of a return as well overall. And I'm not saying this about investments, I'm saying this about life in general, I think, is how I would understand this cultural shift. In the UK, we tend to be holding back a little bit more. We want certainty before we move. In the USA, the mindset is the opposite. The assumption is that everyone is blagging a bit, so you might as well get started, do some basic DD, and then invest in lots of things. Some will fail, a few will do really well, and that's great because the market is big enough for that to be really quite a worthwhile outcome. And that mindset changes everything. It creates an environment where ideas get tested faster, where capital moves quicker, where people are constantly learning by doing. And it's not that they're smarter, it's just that they're less afraid and they're doing more. And so the more experiments you run, the more data points that come in. And many experiments will fail, but ultimately the data points mean that the quality overall becomes a lot higher. Now that's something that we as Muslims outside the US can really take inspiration from and learning from, and we can keep our prudence and principles, but pair them with a bit more boldness and a bit more belief and a willingness to just start. And actually that combination of taking the best of America and taking the best of Britain, combining both of those things together, I think is the winning mixture. And it's no surprise to me that when Brits go over to the USA, and if you think about it historically, a whole bunch of Brits have gone over to the USA in different fields. Michael Moritz, I mean, in the entertainment space, people like Ricky Gervais or Mehdi Hassan, who went over as well, or Riz Ahmed. There's so many Muslims and also non-Muslims who've made that journey across, and many have actually succeeded spectacularly. And I think it's because of this combo of combining the best of both that really unlocks some value. Okay, one of the things I noticed in this trip is that Muslim Americans on the whole have been a little bit looser, let's be honest, when it comes to avoiding riba and avoiding the haram. You'll have the Americans who are happy to eat the meat, right? That is from the Ahlul Kitab. Although the Ahlul Kitab, it's unclear who they are now in the USA. Anyway, you've got a bit more of a relaxed approach to adherence to the Sharia and adherence to halal and haram. So you'd often meet people with conventional loans, mortgages, portfolios, who haven't thought too deeply about Shari'i screening. It's not usually out of disregard, by the way. It's more of a reflection of convenience and how the system's been built up. There's not been as much Islamic finance there. There's not been as much education in this space either. And I think the general basic level of Islamic adherence is a little bit lower overall, right? So the culture doesn't drive them in the same way that it does for Muslims, let's say in the UK, towards being a little bit more conscious and practicing about that. But since October the 7th, something has shifted. There's a growing awareness, not just about where our money sits, but what it supports. And more people are asking the question, is this halal? But also, is this ethical? Does this align with my values? And that's created real momentum for the first time. You're seeing a noticeable push towards sharia-compliant investing, or at the very least, values-aligned investing, where people want to ensure their money isn't funding haram, but also crucially that it's not funding bad things, it's not funding harmful things, it's supporting the community and the people of the light. It's supporting good people, it's doing something good. And there's also this growing interest about diversifying overseas as well, especially given the uncertainty in US politics and the general market as a whole, and this very clear idea now that the US hegemony is on the decline, and then you are going to have a rise of the BRICS countries, particularly China. So as an overall development, I think this is, for Muslims, very encouraging, because for our mission to truly succeed, as in IFG, but also the Ummahs as a whole, we need to be channeling Muslim wealth, but also wealth in general, back into Muslim enterprise, supporting businesses, founders, and ideas that uplift our communities. Whether those Muslims are in the West or in Muslim majority countries, that's what we need to do. So I believe, genuinely believe, that values alignment and Sharia compliance, really, it's not about ticking a box. It's not about saying, oh, we've kind of screened out the Israeli companies or the pro-genocide companies or the highly leveraged companies. It's not just about that. It's about taking the wealth and putting it into companies that are owned by Muslims or in Muslim majority countries, or serving the Muslim community. Because when you take that money and pipe it back into our community, that's when you see this field starting to grow. Okay, for UK investors or anyone outside the US, investing in American assets can actually be pretty attractive. The markets are deep, the returns are solid, and there's a lot of innovation happening. But it needs to be done carefully, because if you don't get the structure right, you can end up losing 20 to 30% of your returns pretty much straight away due to withholding tax on dividends and income and other taxes that come up. And getting that money back from the IRS, let's just say it's painful and it's long and it's not easy. And the same applies in reverse for US investors looking overseas. You guys need to watch out for something called PFIC, or passive foreign investment company rules. So if you invest in certain overseas funds without the right reporting in place, the IRS basically treats them very punitively, and you can end up with massive taxes. And so you can still invest in these companies, but you have to do it properly and with the right disclosures and structures from day one, in order to avoid all of those kind of issues and avoid that punitive tax treatment. So the lesson here is get proper advice, work with firms and partners who properly understand the tax implications for you, understand your own reporting obligations, and make sure your structure is optimized before you send a single pound or dollar overseas and abroad. As for Curate, we are actively setting up structures to be able to do a lot of deals in the USA, both for our US and UK investors. So watch this space. For our existing investments, we've already labeled them with some tax guidance for USA and UK investors, so you can and should look at that to help guide you in terms of which investments would be suitable for you from a tax perspective. Of course, these videos are not financial or tax advice. That is something that you should do yourself, but this should hopefully give you some color. I was profoundly impressed by the entrepreneurial spirit and the progress of the Muslim community in the USA. There are in many ways far more developed than the UK, and in some ways a little bit less developed as well. I mean, the halal food in London is far better, if I'm perfectly honest, than the USA, although the brisket in Houston were fantastic. Shout out to Livon. The city, however, that most impressed me was Dallas. I hadn't quite realized that all of the major Islamic scholars, or at least the famous ones, are in that one city. You've got Sheikh Yasir Qadi, Sheikh Umar Suleiman, Numan Ali Khan, Sheikh Abdul Nasser Jangda. All of them are basically in one city. And the sheer Islamic activity and education that is happening as a result is mind-blowing. And it's not yet completely confirmed, but it's basically highly likely that I'll be moving, inshallah, God willing, to the USA in the next 12 months. And most likely I'll be moving to Dallas if I do that. This will not necessarily be a permanent move, but we will be setting up a permanent office out there for Americans on an ongoing basis. And on that bombshell, we are looking for a head of USA, someone incredibly special, ambitious, hardworking, and versatile, someone with a founder mentality. You'll find the job description linked in our description below. And Americans, I'd love to hear from you. What should I cover next about your country? And for everyone outside of the USA, what would you like to know about this landscape that I didn't cover? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Until next time, Assalamu alaikum.